My father gave me the book Limits to Growth while I was in high school. I found it fascinating then and prophetic now. Noam Chomsky once stated, people do not know what's happening to them, and they do not even know they don't know. I knew about the problems of growth since high school. I knew this time was coming. But World 3 did not explain the social unrest the world has been seeing. That is where cyclodynamics and structural demographics come in. In this presentation, we will learn how system dynamics works, study the interaction of World 3, compared what was predicted to real data 50 years later. Study the effects of overpopulation and use structural demographics to see how the United States is responding. The book Limits to Growth was published in 1972 by the Club of Rome with the help of MIT in creating a simulation called World 3. World 3 simulates resource usage using 1970 estimates, population growth, this is probably the most important area, industrial output. This is what we produce and do, from diapers to aircraft, hair salons to manufacturing. Agricultural, this produces our food. More food, lower prices, this affects population growth. Pollution, all pollution has a time persistence. Some dissipates rapidly, others last longer. If pollution accumulates faster than it is absorbed back into the natural environment, there's a buildup of pollution. More people, more pollution accumulates. In economics, pollution is called an externality. When the cost of an externality is low, production is greater. Higher the cost, less is produced. The question that we have to ask is, how do you measure the cost of pollution? Cliodynamics treats history as a science. Cliodynamics is a transdisciplinary area of research that integrates cultural evolution, economic history, cliometrics, macrosociology, and mathematical modeling of the historical process. An important aspect of the cliodynamics is structural demographics. It takes wealth inequality, quality of health, population density, type of government, and says what can happen. To understand the World 3 simulation, we will need to understand system dynamics. System dynamics is an approach to understanding the nonlinear behavior of complex systems over times using stock, flows, internal feedback loop, table functions, and time delays. To learn system dynamics, we are going to use an example of a single population with births growing the population and deaths reducing the population. The population is a stock. It can be counted. Births and deaths are first derivatives of the population. They are flows that change the population over time. Population cannot grow forever. Feedback is added to limit the population. It is a function of the population size. As population reaches the limit, the birth rate starts dropping, causing the births to decline. There are two delays. The first is the time to realize the population is reaching the limit. The second delay is the time when people start reducing having babies. Increased delays increase overshoot. Overshoot is when population exceeds the population limit, causing negative consequences. There's also a loop. A loop is where feedback to itself. Stress is dependent upon population. Stress affects birth rate, and birth rate affects population. That is a loop. So we talked about loops in the last one. So we come here and identify loops. So you see that loop we talked about, population stress, birth back to population. So now we're going to start with delays of 0. These are super intelligent beings. that realize a problem the minute they see it and act on it immediately. So you see how smooth things are. Next, it takes about a generation to realize now. And these are very intelligent because they act on it immediately. So you see the population goes up fairly smooth, but you see the birth rate jumps up to about 1,700. Now, these are fairly smart human beings, and this is going to be a delay of a generation before they start acting, after they realize it. So you see the population goes up to about 130, the births go up to about 2,000. So now these are normal human beings, and we take the simulation out to 2 generations. So it takes 2 generations to act. So you see the population goes up to about 150 and drops to about 80. Now this final one, we're going to increase the birth rate just a little, 0.02%. So now what you do is you see it starts just a little bit earlier, it's a little bit steeper, but you see how much overshoot there is, an oscillation. So you see what just a little bit of delay and just a little bit of increase in birth rate does. There are many reality issues with this translation, but it does show you the delay effect and how system dynamics work. Now we will talk about the World3 model. This is a simplified version where you can see all the relationships. The main areas are population, industrial output, pollution, non-renewable resources, and food. You can see the input to populations are births per year and deaths per year, just like in the example. Notice the tiny plus and minuses on the inputs of the populations. Births have a plus and deaths have a minus. Population affects 5 other things: births per year, deaths per year, industrial output per capita, food per capita, and services per capita. Mortality is the death rate. Health services reduce mortality. Food per capita reduces mortality, but pollution increases mortality, and increased mortality increases the deaths per year. Pollution is an important aspect of the world today, with forever chemicals, climate change, even hormone-like chemicals that affect the human reproduction cycle. World3 does not do a good job of simulating climate change or social issues. Now we're going to look at the simulation model of World3. Here's the birth per year formula. Since only half the population can give birth, women, that's the 0.5, times the population of reproductive age, 15 to 44, times the fertility, divided by the reproductive years. World3 has many indicators, but the 5 most important ones are population, human welfare, ecological footprint, pollution, and renewable resources. We see 3 of them here. Population is divided into 4 groups. World3 uses these groups to define work population and reproductive age. You can see the birth formula right here. Okay, that we talked about already. As people move to the next group, the stock, each age group has a different mortality rate. You can see the young have a very low mortality rate, while the older people have a much higher mortality rate, which makes sense. The older you are, the more likely you will die. Human welfare is the average of life expectancy, education index, and GDP index. I see a problem here because the GDP per capita is a mean. Due to wealth inequality, I think that a medium would be a much better, closer to reality. When we talk about ecological footprint, here I feel it's very weak. As you can see, climate change has not been added to this. Pollution is much more complex. We start with the Persistent Pollution General Index. Here, population, industrial emissions, resource usage, toxic index, and a multiplier combined. Next, we have the Persistent Pollution Generation Rate. Adds agriculture, all multiplied by a technology factor. This technology factor is what techno-optimists think will save us. Remember how the delay in the simple population caused overshoot? Well, the persistent pollution transmission delays for 30 years. This means pollution from 30 years ago is affecting us now, and the pollution now will affect us from 30 years from now. I believe a new section should be added to model CO2 and climate change because of the positive feedback loop of climate change causing greater climate change. AU. This uses the original parameters. Second is business as usual 2, identified as BAU2. Here the amount of resources are doubled. 3 is comprehensive technology, identified by CT. This is the techno-optimist dream, especially high technologies to handle pollution. The last is stabilized world, identified by SW. Changes in societal values and priorities. Population stabilizes in the 21st century. Well-being is at a high level. A world without Republicans. Here are the results of the 4 baseline simulation. The indicators shown are population, resources, food, industrial output, and pollution. With business as usual, there is resource starvation. You can see the industrial output and food peaks around 2020, with the population declining in about 2030. Business as usual too is pollution resources. See the orange line going off the chart? With the food dropping quickly in about 2040 and population dropping quickly in about 2050. Comprehensive technology, food peaks around 2025 as pollution grows. Industrial output peaks in about 2040 and pollution peaks in about 2050. As pollution diminishes in 2050, food climbs again. The population stabilizes in about 2060. In stabilized world output stabilizes in about 2020, as does population. Here are 4 graphs with detailed data, the actual data from 2022. Human welfare, population, births and deaths. The 50-year real data is in black. If you look closely, you can see human welfare the black is starting to level off. The population is destroying because the birth rate is still high. To me, this is the most worrying part of the simulation, as I will show you later. The death rate has been dropping for decades, but now is starting to level off. These 4 graphs are how the Earth is handling growth, pollution, ecological footprint, food per capita, and renewable resources. We're doing okay on producing food and conserving natural resources when compared to the original simulation. There's also pollution and ecological footprint graph here. This is where I think the original simulation is weak. The pollution dynamics does not take into account the avalanche effect of climate change and was not accurately modeled. Climate change is going to have devastating effects on ecological footprint, food production, and human welfare. Here's a graph of human population growth plotted from 1700 to 2100. The peak birth rate is about 1950, and it peaked again about 20 years later, but has been declining ever since. Population is still growing at 1% a year. This will cause social problems and planetary physical side effects, as we will learn. Universe 25, Dr. John Calhoun. In 1968, Dr. John B. Calhoun placed 8 mice in a habitat with a carrying capacity for over 3,000 mice. At the end of the experiment, all mice were dead. After the population density reached a threshold, overpopulation created stress and changed social habits. The same behaviors are being seen today in populated areas. This is that story.
The work of Dr. John Calhoun at the National Institute of Health in Washington, D.C. has attempted to answer this question. In a unique experiment that took years to complete, Dr. Calhoun used white mice to study population growth and its effects on individual behavior. In addition to his renowned research papers, he has recorded some of these observations on film. In this 16-cell mouse habitat, utopian conditions of nutrition, comfort, and housing were provided for a potential population of over 3,000 mice. Yet, in spite of ideal conditions, the mouse population met with catastrophe. Individuals were kept track of by color markings on their fur. Factors which normally control population growth, such as predation by owls or cats, were eliminated. Transmissible disease was also reduced. In effect, the mouse universe simulated the present situation of a continually expanding population of humans. To see how Dr. Calhoun's mouse universe grew, we'll use the familiar population graph again. Within the first 100 days, the mice went through the period Dr. Calhoun called strive. This was a period of adjustment. Territories were established and nests were made. The next period lasted about 250 days. The population of the mice doubled every 60 days. This was called the exploit period. The use of resources became unequal. Although each living unit was identical in structure and opportunities, more food and water was consumed in some areas. As the population increased, most mice associated eating and drinking with the presence of others, and crowding developed in certain units. The third period, consisting of 300 days, found the population of mice leveling off. This was called the equilibrium period. Dr. Calhoun noticed that the newer generations of young were inhibited, since most space was already socially defined. At this time, some unusual behavior became noticeable. Violence became prevalent. Excess males strived for acceptance, were rejected, and withdrew. Huddling together, they would exhibit brief flurries of violence among themselves. the effects of violence became increasingly visible. Certain individuals became targets of repeated attack. These individuals would have badly chewed and scarred tails. Other young mice growing into adulthood exhibited an even different type of behavior. Dr. Calhoun called these individuals the beautiful ones. Their time was devoted solely to grooming, eating, and sleeping. They never involved themselves with others, engaged in sex, nor would they fight. All appeared as a beautiful exhibit of the species, with keen, alert eyes and a healthy, well-kept body. These mice, however, could not cope with unusual stimuli. Though they looked inquisitive, they were, in fact, very stupid. Dr. Calhoun called the last period the die phase, leading the population into extinction. Although the mouse utopia could house 3,000, the population began to decline at 2,200. In the shift from the equilibrium to the die phase, each animal became less aware of associates, despite all animals being pushed closer together. Dr. Calhoun concluded that the mice could not effectively deal with the repeated contact of so many individuals. The evidence of violence increased to the point where most individuals had had their tails bitten to some degree. Eventually, the entire mouse population perished. Dr. Calhoun's experiment is a classic example of a typical population and its growth when left unchecked.
Increased violence. Universe 25 demonstrated that what could happen with overpopulation with unlimited resources. But the Earth has limited resources, and that is reflected in the cost. Many civilizations have demonstrated that when society becomes too large and too complex to manage, society breaks down. This can be explained by using structural demographics. Here is a chart of USA anti-government riots in dark red and demonstrations in green from 1945 to 2019. It does not include the last 3 years. There are over 3,000 BLM demonstrations in June of 2020 alone. I was at and watched some of the demonstrations and / riots in Portland, Oregon. But there are over 100 days straight of nightly riots in the summer of 2020. Every week, violence makes major headlines. There is even a coup attempt on January 6, 2021. To explain why social unrest is happening, we will look at political stress indicator, PSI or PSI. There are 4 parts to the equation that are interacting: the people, the rich, the government, and instability. Instability. There is a positive feedback loop. Instability causes more instability. This is the avalanche effect I was talking about earlier. Misinformation is rampant in America. Only 58% trust national media. The number of social unrest events has climbed dramatically in the past few years. The coup attempt on January 6, 2021, and the lies that created it continues. 1 in 5 Americans think political violence is acceptable. The population. Wealth inequality, justice inequality in the general population creates instability. A higher population density creates unrest and violence. The elites. 3,500 people a day become millionaires in 2021. Bezos and Musk are competing going into space. The top 10% of the U.S. population has over 70% of all wealth and almost 90% of all stocks. Over half of Congress are millionaires. The state. Only 27% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in the 14 major American institutions. America has $30 trillion in debt, and that is 128% of the GDP. Plug all these facts into the formula, and you have a high political stress indicator. These graphs show what happens when using structural demographics. On the first graph, you can see that the collective well-being is starting to decrease, but social pressure for crisis not changing much. But once the social pressure for crisis starts to rise, it increases very fast. It is usually caused by some trigger. Just think of the death of George Floyd and the social unrest it caused. The next graph is social pressure for instability, PSI, calculated in 2010. You can see PSI starting to climb when President W. Bush, W, was in office. It exploded by the 2008 housing crisis, and in the Trump years, it went off the charts due to his lies and disregard for social norms. Limits to Growth was published 50 years ago. The world has had 50 years to prepare. China is illegally claiming Taiwan in the South China Sea. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Inflation is affecting the world. MAGA morons are trying to overthrow democracy in America. The UK is in turmoil. The Amazon rainforest is being devastated. Drought is ravaging western United States. Extinction on the planet is 100 to 1,000 times larger than background extinction rate and 10 to 100 times higher than any previous extinction. The loss of biodiversity is losing not only species, but genetic history of those species. Plagues, droughts, floods, wars happening across the world. Is this God's work? Is this the Bible's book of Revelation coming true? No. It is man and man alone causing this destruction through greed and ignorance. There are some that are actively fighting possible solutions because they are greedy for wealth or power. World3 is a physical model. Cliodynamics is a social model. Together they help us understand the world we live in. When will we ever learn? When will we ever learn?
Хлопці, де, скажи мені, героями стали на війні, коли ж збагнеться світ, коли збагнеш і ти. Де бійці, скажи мені, де скажи мені, писать листи, як батькам шукать синів, війна забрала, лежать в труні, коли ж збагнеться світ, коли збагнеш і ти. Скажи мені, де їхні труни, цвинтар, де, скажи мені, де стоять хрести, цвинтар, де, скажи мені, в ланах, де квіти ростуть сумні, коли ж збагнеться світ. скажи мені, де вони поділись, квіти де, скажи мені, де їх знайти, квіти де, скажи мені, дівчата зірвали їх з ланів, коли ж збагне це світ, коли збагне.